Welcome, nighttime traveler, to Sleepy Bedtime Stories, your haven of stories and tales to help you sleep. This is the place where traditional tales come to life and accompany you on your journey to rest. But first, tell me where you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. I'd love to know if you're joining me from your bed, from a cozy sofa, or perhaps from some corner of the world where you can still feel the spirit of ancient tales. Please leave me a comment. Every message from you is like a fragment of a precious amphora. If you'd like to support this space of peace and relaxation, subscribe and share the channel so that more people can find their refuge here. And now, take a slow, deep breath, because tonight we're going to dive into another thrilling story.
A complete history of the Aztec Empire, Tenochtitlán and its mysteries. Chapter 1: The origins of the Mexicas and the founding of Tenochtitlán. Close your eyes. Take a deep breath. Let the weight of this day slowly dissolve, like mist over a lake at dawn. Tonight, you will travel far away. You will travel to a time when the world was different, when the earth was sacred and the gods walked amongst men, when an impossible city rose from the waters of an ancient lake and became the heart of an empire that still amazes us today and fills us with questions. This is the story of the Mexicas, the story of a people who began as nothing and ended up being everything. The story of a city born of a prophecy and which grew until it touched the sky. The story of Tenochtitlán, the city of the eagle and the serpent, the city upon the water, the city that the Spaniards called the most beautiful they had ever seen, and which later, with a contradiction that speaks volumes about human nature, they destroyed down to its very foundations. But before the destruction came the creation, and before the creation came the path, and before the path came the origin. And the origin of all this lies in a place the Mexicas called Aztlan. No one knows with absolute certainty where Aztlan was. The colonial chroniclers who recorded the oral traditions of the Mexicas after the Spanish conquest described a place to the north, beyond the great deserts, beyond the rivers that flow into unknown seas. A place with water, in abundance, with 7 sacred caves from which the 7 original peoples emerged. Modern archaeologists have proposed locations ranging from northern Mexico to the southwestern United States, from the Pacific coast to the arid lands of the states we now know as Nayarit or Sinaloa. But perhaps the exact location matters less than what Aztlan represented in the memory of a people, the place from whence they came, the origin that justified all that would follow, the sacred root of a tree that would come to cast an extraordinary shadow. Imagine that place just as the Mexicas themselves described it in their codices and tales. A place of abundance and tranquility, with a blue lake surrounded by mountains, with birds of brilliant plumage that filled the air with color and sound. A place where life was easy because nature was generous. A place, in short, where there was no need to go anywhere else. And yet, something called them to leave. Something drove them south, towards the unknown, towards a destiny they could not yet imagine, but which someone or something had already mapped out for them. That something was their God, the God of the Mexica, the God who guided them on their long migration and promised them a new land where they could found their city and empire, was called Huitzilopochtli. His name means, in Nahuatl, the hummingbird of the south is greater than, or the left-handed hummingbird, depending on the interpretation. It is a name that surprises when heard for the first time, because it does not sound like the name of a warrior god, of a sun god, of a god to whom sacrifices and battles were offered. A hummingbird seems too small, too delicate, too fragile to bear the weight of a marching people and an imperial destiny. But in the Mexica worldview, the hummingbird had a profound meaning that is not apparent at first glance. The Mexicas believed that warriors killed in battle or sacrificed in honor of the gods became hummingbirds and accompanied the sun on its path across the sky. The hummingbird was, therefore, the image of the warrior in his most spiritual, lightest, most eternally active form. Huitzilopochtli was not a god of tranquility, but of movement, of struggle, of unceasing energy. He was, in the most literal sense of the word, a god of the road. And it was that god, through his priests and oracles, who commanded the Mexicas to leave Aztlan. The exact date of that departure is a matter of debate amongst historians, but Mexica traditions place the start of the migration around the year 1110 or 1116 AD. This means that the Mexica people were on the move for more than 200 years before finding the place their God had promised them. 200 years. More than 7 generations. More than anyone can remember in a single lifetime. Think about that whilst you feel the warmth of your bed, the stillness of this space that is yours and safe. An entire people for over 200 years without a place to call home, sleeping under the stars, traveling through deserts and mountains, crossing rivers and traversing foreign lands, guided only by the promise of a God and the memory of their elders. That migration was neither continuous nor linear. The Mexicas stopped at many places along the way. In some, they stayed for years or decades. farming the land, building temporary settlements, establishing relationships with the peoples who already inhabited those lands. In some of these places they were welcomed. In others they were rejected and expelled. And in all of them, something always reminded them that this was not the place, that the true place lay further on, further south, closer to the sun. Colonial chroniclers described the stages of that migration in detail, blending the historical and the mythical in a way that is, in itself, characteristic of the Mexica way of understanding time and memory. In those descriptions, the Mexica carried the image of Huitzilopochtli in a sacred ark, and the priests who carried it received messages from the god in dreams and visions. The god spoke to them, guided them, punished them when they disobeyed, and rewarded them when they persevered. It was a migration that was as muchly and religiously significant as it was geographically. An exodus, in the fullest sense of the word. Along the way, the Mexicas developed the characteristics that would define them as a people. Tenacity in the face of adversity, the ability to adapt without losing their identity, the military prowess that would soon make them feared by their neighbors, and a relationship with the gods that was absolutely central to everything they did. Because in the Mexica worldview, the gods were not distant, abstract beings who looked down on the world from on high. They were active presences, hungry, who needed to be constantly fed to maintain the order of the cosmos. That idea that the gods need to be fed so that the sun continues to rise, so that the rain continues to fall, so that the maize continues to grow, lies at the heart of the entire Mexica civilization. It is the idea that explains the human sacrifices which so shocked and horrified the Spanish, and which have since defined the popular image of the Aztecs. But before judging, and this story is not here to judge, but to understand, it is necessary to understand the universe in which that practice made sense. The Mexicas, like all the Mesoamerican peoples who preceded them, lived in a cosmos that had been created and destroyed several times. According to their cosmogony, there had been 4 suns prior to the present one, and each of them had ended in a catastrophe that wiped out the humanity inhabiting it. Is greater than the 5th sun, the sun under which the Mexicas lived, had been born in Teotihuacan, the city of the gods, when the primordial gods sacrificed themselves by leaping into a bonfire to give life and movement to the new sun. If the gods had given their blood so that the sun might exist, human blood was the fuel needed to keep it alive. It was a cosmic debt that had to be paid continually, or the sun would stop and the world would end in darkness. From our modern perspective, we can see in that cosmogony an elaborate and coherent belief system that gave meaning to a practice that would otherwise seem simply cruel. From the Mexica perspective, it was not cruelty, it was responsibility. It was the burden humans bore for the privilege of existing in a cosmos that the gods had created at an enormous cost. But let us leave the cosmos for a moment and return to the journey. For the Mexica migration still has much to tell us before reaching the lake where everything would change. At some point during that long pilgrimage, perhaps towards the end of the 12th century or the beginning of the 13th century AD, the Mexica reached the central highlands of Mexico. This region, which we now know as the Valley of Mexico or the Basin of Mexico, was at that time a densely populated, politically complex, and ecologically extraordinary. At the heart of that valley lay a system of interconnected lakes, the largest of which was Lake Texcoco, surrounded by volcanoes which, on clear days, reflected their perfect image in the calm waters. That region was not an empty territory waiting to be discovered. It was the political and cultural heart of Mesoamerica, heir to a tradition dating back to Teotihuacan, the great city that had dominated the highlands several centuries earlier and whose ruins remained. In the time of the Mexicas, a sacred and mysterious place that no one had built, or so it seemed, except the gods themselves. When the Mexicas arrived in the Valley of Mexico, they found a world that already had its own rules, its own hierarchies, its own cities and its own gods, is greater than the peoples inhabiting the shores of Lake Texcoco. The Tepanecs, the Acolhuas, and the Culhuas regarded the new arrivals with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. The Mexicas were not yet a fearsome people. They were, at best, useful warriors who could serve as mercenaries. At worst, they were troublesome intruders occupying lands that others had already laid claim to. That initial marginality of the Mexicas in the Valley of Mexico is one of the most fascinating aspects of their history, because from that marginality their greatness would be born. A people who arrive late, who have no land of their own, nor an established position, which has to serve others to survive, develops a fierce determination and an adaptive ability that established peoples, comfortable in their privileges, do not need to develop. Adversity was, paradoxically, the best school the Mexicas could have had. Their early years in the Valley of Mexico were marked by humiliation and service. They served as warriors to the Culhuas of Culhuacan, who were considered the most direct heirs to the Toltec tradition, the civilization that had succeeded Teotihuacan and which, in Mesoamerican cultural memory, represented the pinnacle of sophistication and refinement. To be accepted by the Kulwas was, for any people of the highlands, a kind of cultural legitimization. The Mexicas knew this, and when the Kulhuas offered them land in exchange for their military services, even though the land was full of snakes and difficult to cultivate, the Mexicas accepted it with a gratitude that masked their determination to press on. And on those difficult lands, in that subordinate position, the Mexicas waited. They waited and observed and learned. They learnt the customs of the highlands. They learnt the cultural sophistication of the Kulwas. They learnt the complex politics of alliances and rivalries among the principalities of the Valley of Mexico. They learnt to make themselves indispensable. There was an episode in that relationship with the Kulhuas which colonial chroniclers recounted in detail and which speaks eloquently of the nature of the Mexicas during that period of their history. The lord of the Kulhuas, appreciating the military services of the Mexicas, offered them something that in the Mesoamerican context was an extraordinary honor, one of his daughters, a princess of Toltec blood, to become the wife of the god Huitzilopochtli and the symbolic mother of the Mexica people. The Mexicas accepted the offering, but what they did with it was something the Kulhuas had not expected. According to the tradition recorded by chroniclers, the Mexica priests sacrificed the princess and flayed her body, using her skin to clothe one of the priests. When the lord of the Kulhuas arrived at the ceremony he had been invited to witness, he saw his daughter transformed into a ritual mask of flesh and was horrified. He expelled the Mexicas from his lands immediately. This story, which may seem simply terrible when told in this way, was interpreted by the Mexicas in a completely different manner. For them, the princess had not been murdered but deified. She had become the mother of Huitzilopochtli in the most ritual and profound sense. Her transformation as part of the sacred ceremony was the greatest honor she could receive. Her father's reaction of horror was, from the Mexica perspective, proof that the Kulhuas did not understand the sacred nature of what the Mexicas were doing. But the practical result was different. The Mexicas were driven out once more, and they set out on foot again. And on that journey, on that seemingly endless quest, they finally reached the shores of Lake Texcoco. And there, according to the tradition we all know, they sought the sign their God had promised them. The sign that Huitzilopochtli had promised his people was specific and extraordinary. He had told them that when they saw an eagle perched on a prickly pear, devouring a snake, that would be the place where they would found their city. The city that would be the navel of the world. The city from which they would rule an empire. the city that would be the center of everything. Imagine the Mexicas arriving on the shores of Lake Texcoco around the year 1325 AD. Weary from centuries of travel, hardened by adversity, bearers of a promise that had been passed down from generation to generation for over 2 centuries, gazing at the grey waters of the lake, with snow-capped volcanoes in the background, with the breeze coming off the water carrying the scent of dampness and lake life. And on some small islet, on some rock emerging from the reeds and cattails of the shore, a golden eagle, with its wings spread towards the sun, holding a snake in its talons, perched on a prickly pear cactus bearing red, blood-red prickly pears. The sign, the promise fulfilled, the end of the road, that moment which the Mexicas remembered forever as the founding act of their nation, is one of the most significant moments in the entire history of the Americas. It is depicted in the oldest codices that survived the conquest. It is carved in stone on monuments. It is present today, 700 years later, at the center of the Mexican flag, where the eagle, the serpent, and the prickly pear remain the emblem of a nation that found its identity in that mythical moment by the lake. But the practical reality of that moment was far more humble than the grandeur that historical memory would bestow upon it. The islet where the Mexicas saw the sign of their god was small, marshy, with no obvious resources, surrounded by water and the powerful principalities that already dominated the region. There was not enough dry land to cultivate. There was no timber for building. There was no stone to erect walls. There was water and reeds and waterfowl and the vast sky above the lake. Any other people in those circumstances would have seen that islet as an impossible place to found a city. Too small, too isolated, too limited in resources. The Mexicas saw it differently. They saw precisely in its limitations its greatest advantage. An islet in the middle of a lake is, first and foremost, a natural fortress. The water surrounding it was its best defense. The peoples settled on the mainland, who looked down on them, could not attack them without crossing the lake. And crossing the lake required canoes. And canoes were a field in which the Mexicas would soon become masters. The founding of Tenochtitlán, whose name comes from Tetl, meaning stone, Nochtli, meaning prickly pear or cactus fig, and Tlán, which is a locative suffix meaning place of, took place in the 13th year of the reed in the Mexica calendar, which corresponds approximately to the year 1325 AD, although some researchers propose 1345 as an alternative date. The sources are not unanimous, and perhaps that ambiguity has its own poetry. The founding of such a great city was also, inevitably, a process, not a single moment. What is clear is that from day one, the construction of Tenochtitlan was an extraordinary feat of engineering. The Mexicas, who had experience of working in lake environments from their years of wandering the shores of the lake, quickly developed the technique of the chinampas, which in Spanish are popularly known as floating gardens, although that name does not accurately describe their nature. The chinampas did not float. They were rectangles of fertile soil constructed on the lake through a laborious and ingenious process. Stakes were driven into the lake bed to mark out the perimeter. Branches were then woven together and filled with alternating layers of lake vegetation and the fertile mud from the lake bed, extracted by canoe. Over time, the roots of the trees and plants growing on the chinampas penetrated the lake bed and anchored the structure permanently. They were not floating gardens. They were land created where there had previously been only water. Think of the audacity of that idea. Land does not exist, so we created it. The lake has no shore, so we built the shore. There is not enough space, so we made it. In that attitude towards the limits of what is possible, in that determination to turn obstacles into opportunities, lay the spirit that would lead the Mexicas from a marshy islet to the capital of an empire in less than 2 centuries. The chinampas solved the problem of food. Over time, the chinampa system surrounding Tenochtitlan became one of the most productive agricultural systems of the ancient world. The chinampa soil, constantly renewed with silt from the lake, yielded multiple harvests a year. Maize, beans, squash, chilies, tomatoes, amaranth all grew in such abundance that they astonished the Europeans when they arrived. Accustomed as they were to the uncertain harvests of their continental fields. But food was not the only challenge the founders of Tenochtitlan had to overcome. There was no fresh water on the islet either. Lake Texcoco had brackish water, unsuitable for drinking. And building a city required enormous quantities of fresh water, not only for drinking but also for cooking, for rituals, for cleaning the streets and canals, for the gardens of the temples and palaces. The solution the Mexicas found to this problem was, once again, a feat of remarkable audacity and engineering. They built aqueducts, which in Nahuatl were called apantli, that carried fresh water from the springs of Chapultepec on the western shore of the lake, to the heart of the city. These were not stone aqueducts like the Romans, but elevated double pipe channels, so that when one was being cleaned, the other could continue to function. The water traveled for kilometers over the lake, supported by wooden piles, before reaching the city's fountains and reservoirs. That concern for clean water, for cleanliness, for public hygiene, is another aspect of Tenochtitlan that astonished the Spanish conquistadors. The city had a network of canals that served as both a transport and a sanitation system. Human waste was collected in special canoes and taken to the chinampas, where it was used as fertilizer. The streets were cleaned regularly. There were public toilets in many neighborhoods. At a time when European cities dumped their waste directly onto the streets, Tenochtitlan maintained a standard of hygiene that its visitors would describe as extraordinary. But all this was still in the future when the city's founders drove their first stake into the lake bed and began to build the first temple dedicated to Huitzilopochtli. That first temple was small, built of perishable materials, with wood and straw and adobe. It was nothing compared to what was to come, but it was the center. It was the navel. It was the point from which the city would grow outwards in a spiral, conquering the lake meter by meter, chinampa by chinampa, canal by canal. The city grew, and with it grew the identity of its inhabitants. The Mexicas, who had arrived at the lake as a marginalized people with no land of their own, were transforming into something different. They were becoming Tenochtcas, the inhabitants of Tenochtitlan. They were putting down roots, literally. At the bottom of the lake they had chosen as their home. And with their roots came social organization. The Mexicas divided their city into 4 large sectors or neighborhoods, which in Nahuatl were called Campan, and each corresponded to one of the 4 cardinal points, which in Mexica cosmogony had their own colors, deities and meanings. The north was black, the color of Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, the god of darkness and destiny. The south was blue, the color of Huitzilopochtli, the god of the sun and war. Is greater than the east was red, the color of dawn and of the planet Venus in its aspect as the morning star. The west was white, the color of the wind and of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. At the center of that cosmic cross stood the Templo Maya, the temple that would eventually grow to become the most important pyramid in all of Mesoamerica, with its twin stairways ascending towards the sanctuaries of Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc, the god of rain. The Templo Mayor was not merely the geographical center of the city. It was the center of the universe. It was the place where the world of humans and the world of the gods met, where the blood of the sacrifices reached directly the gods who needed it to keep the sun on its path. That cosmological structure of the city, with its 4 sectors and its sacred center, was not arbitrary. It was a miniature reproduction of the universe as the Mexicas understood it. To live in Tenochtitlán was to live at the center of the cosmos. It was to dwell at the navel of the world, as they themselves called their city. And that conviction, that certainty of being in the most important place in the universe, fostered in its inhabitants a pride and a determination that made them feared by their enemies and admired by their allies. In the early years of Tenochtitlan, however, the Mexicas were still far from dominating the Valley of Mexico. They remained, politically, subordinate to the Tepanecs of Azcapotzalco, the most powerful lordship in the region at that time. They paid tribute to the Tepanecs. They fought as warriors in their armies. They were, for all practical purposes, subjects of a greater power. But even within that subordination, the Mexicas accumulated experience, strength and knowledge. Every war in which they took part as allies of the Tepanecs taught them something new about the art of battle. Every year of tribute paid reminded them with crystal clarity of what they wanted to be, not the payers, but the collectors. Not the subordinates, but those who give the orders. And so, in the apparent tranquility of that city, rising from the lake, beneath the gaze of the stars reflected in the night waters of Lake Texcoco, something was taking shape that did not yet have a clear name, but would soon acquire one. The nucleus of power was forming that, in less than a century, would redraw the map of the whole of Mesoamerica. The first Tlatoanis, the first rulers of Tenochtitlan, governed with the modesty of those who know that the time has not yet come to display their full strength. Acamapichtli, who was the first recognized Tlatoani of Tenochtitlan, assumed power around the year 1376 AD. He was the son of a Mexica nobleman and a princess of Culhuacan, which gave him the prized Toltec blood that legitimized power in the Mesoamerican world. With Acamapichtli, the Mexicas ceased to be merely warriors and became nobles as well, heirs to a cultural tradition that gave them the right to rule. It was a brilliant political move. By uniting their blood with that of the Culhuas, the Mexicas resolved in one fell swoop the problem of their humble and peripheral origins. They were no longer outsiders without lineage. They were heirs of the Toltecs, children of the great civilizing tradition of Mesoamerica. Blood and politics achieved what military force alone could not accomplish so quickly. Acamapichtli ruled for almost 20 years with prudence and vision. He was succeeded by Huitzilihuitl, his son, whose name means hummingbird's feather, a clear reference to Huitzilopochtli that shows how deeply the tutelary god was woven into the Mexica identity, even in the personal names of their rulers. And Huitzilihuitl was succeeded by Chimalpopoca, whose name means smoking shield. Those early Tlatoanes ruled in the decades preceding the Great Leap. During their reigns, Tenochtitlán grew in population, in extent over the lake, in cultural sophistication. The temples grew larger, neighborhoods multiplied, canals extended. The city on the water took shape, gained permanence, became more than just a village of lake refugees. And whilst Tenochtitlan was growing on the lake, the Valley of Mexico was experiencing the final years of Tepanec rule. Tezozomoc, the great lord of Azcapotzalco, had built up a power that extended over almost the entire basin. He was a shrewd politician, a formidable warrior, a ruler who knew how to use force and diplomacy with equal effectiveness. The Mexicas served him well, and he used them well. It was a relationship of mutual convenience that worked as long as the balance of power remained stable. But balances do not last forever. And when Tezozomoc died around the year 1426 AD, he left behind a power that his heirs were unable to maintain with his skill. And in that moment of Tepanec weakness, the Mexicas found their opportunity. But that story belongs to the next chapter. The story of the Triple Alliance. The story of Itzcoatl and Tlacaelel and the birth of the empire. The story of the people who were marginalized and became the center of the Mesoamerican world. Tonight, in this first chapter, we have traveled from Aztlan to Lake Texcoco. We have walked alongside a people through 200 years of wandering and searching. We have seen the eagle perched upon the prickly pear. We have watched as determined hands drove the first stakes into the bottom of a lake to create land where none existed. We have seen the birth of a city that would become, in its time, one of the greatest in the world. And now, at this moment when history pauses gently to let you rest, there is something in all of that which may stay with you as you sleep. The idea that great beginnings do not always seem great at first. The idea that adversity can be the best teacher. The idea that sometimes the place that seems impossible, the marshy islet in the middle of the lake, the place nobody wants, can become the center of everything. And the idea, perhaps the most reassuring of all, that long journeys have their own rhythm. The Mexicas walked for 200 years before reaching their destination. They did not arrive in a day. They did not arrive in a lifetime. They arrived in the time it had to be. You too will arrive, wherever you wish to go, in the time it takes. But now is not the time to walk. Now is the time to rest. The waters of the imaginary lake surrounding your bed are calm tonight. The volcanoes in the distance are soft shadows in the darkness. The stars are reflected in the water, making the lake and the sky one infinite whole. The eagle has already found its prickly pear. The journey is over for tonight. It is time to close your eyes and let the darkness gently carry you to where your body needs to go. To that place without time or space, where sleep does its silent and necessary work. Sleep. Lake Texcoco waits peacefully beneath the stars. The city will continue to grow tomorrow. Tonight, just rest. Complete history of the Aztec Empire, Tenochtitlán and its mysteries. Chapter 2. Life, the gods, and the expansion of the Aztec Empire. There are cities born of mud and others born of dreams. Tenochtitlán was born of both at once. From the thick black mud of Lake Texcoco, which its founders dug up shovel by shovel until they had built islands where there had been nothing before. And from the dream of an entire people who believed, with unshakable faith, that the gods had chosen them to hold the world upon their shoulders. Close your eyes. Imagine you are floating on the calm surface of a lake that reflects the sky like a mirror rippled by the breeze. The water smells of wet earth, of reeds, of something vaguely reminiscent of dried fish and burnt copal. On the shores, the mountains stand out against a sky that at this hour of the afternoon has the colors of copper and jade, two materials that this people loved more than gold. And in the center of the lake, emerging from the waters as if the earth itself had decided to rise up, there is a city which, in the year 1420, does not yet exist in its full glory, but which is growing, which is taking shape, which is becoming something the world had never seen before and will not see again for a long time. This is the story of that city. But more than the story of its stones, its canals and its temples, it is the story of the people who lived there, of the men and women who woke up every morning beneath that same sky and lived their lives with an intensity that we, from this distance of centuries can scarcely imagine. It is the story of their gods, who were many and demanding and profoundly human in their contradictions. It is the story of their understanding of time, death, sacrifice, beauty, power. It is, ultimately, the story of how a people who arrived in the Valley of Mexico as nomads without a land of their own managed, in less than 2 centuries, to build the most powerful empire Mesoamerica had ever known. Let's start at the beginning. Not the beginning of Tenochtitlán, which we already covered in the first chapter, but the beginning of what it means to live there. The texture of an ordinary morning in the heart of the Aztec world. In those pivotal years of the 15th century, when the empire was at its zenith and the city in all its splendor, dawn breaks over the lake with a deceptive gentleness. The sky slowly lightens in the east, first with a pearly gray that turns to pink, then to orange, then into the deep blue that heralds the sun's presence. And when the sun appears, when its golden disk peeks over the snow-capped mountains that close off the eastern horizon, something happens in the city that occurs every morning yet never loses its solemnity. The priests atop the Templo Mayor light the sacred fire. That fire is not merely light or heat. It is an affirmation. It is the confirmation that the sun has risen once more, that the universe has not collapsed during the night, that the gods have accepted the tribute of the previous night and have allowed the world to continue. For the Aztecs, dawn was not an automatic natural phenomenon. It was an achievement. It was the result of constant, never-ending work that humanity carried out to keep the cosmos functioning. And that work had a name that the Aztecs knew from childhood and which guided their entire existence: sacrifice. But before we speak of the gods and of sacrifice, before we delve into that aspect of Aztec cosmology which has so fascinated and unsettled outside observers, let us do something simpler. Let us follow an ordinary man, an ordinary citizen of Tenochtitlán, through his day. For the grand narrative is always made up of small stories, and the Aztec civilization, in all its complexity, cannot be understood without first understanding what it meant to be a person within it. Let's call him Itzcoatl. Not the great Tlatoani who would bear that name whilst in power, but a man of the people, a feather craftsman who works in the neighborhoods of the Amantica, the master featherworkers whose art was so highly prized that nobles and priests vied for their creations. Itzcoatl is 30 years old, has a wife named Xochitl, 2 children who go to school and a small house in the neighborhood of Moyotlán, to the southwest of the great central square. He wakes before dawn because his trade demands it. Working with feathers requires the best light, and the best light of day is that of the rising sun, which falls horizontally and softly upon the workbenches and makes the colors of the quetzal, the hummingbird, and the macaw shine with an intensity that the midday light flattens and destroys. So Itzcoatl rises in the darkness, whilst his wife and children still sleep, and the first thing he does is what all Aztecs do upon waking. He offers a small tribute to the dawn, a drop of blood from his own earlobe, which he draws with a Maggie thorn onto a piece of paper that he will later burn. It is a small gesture, almost automatic, like that of someone saying a morning prayer without thinking too much about the words. But it is also a deeply significant gesture, a reminder that the life he has does not belong to him entirely, that it is a loan from the gods that must be repaid little by little. That idea that life is a loan lies at the heart of everything the Aztecs believed and everything they did. And to understand it, one must understand their cosmology, which was both more complex and more coherent than the first Europeans who encountered it were willing to acknowledge. The Aztecs believed that the world in which they lived was the fifth sun. Before theirs, there had been 4 cosmic eras, 4 distinct creations of the world, all of which had ended in catastrophe. The first sun was destroyed by jaguars, the second by devastating winds, the third by a rain of fire, the fourth by floods. And at each of those endings, the gods had had to start afresh, building a universe from the ruins of the previous one. The fifth sun, the one that illuminates the Aztec world, was born in Teotihuacan in the absolute darkness that followed the end of the fourth world. And it was born because a small and humble god named Nanahuatzin had the courage to throw himself into the sacred fire when the powerful and arrogant god named Tenochtitlan hesitated before the flames. Nanahuatzin became the sun. Tenochtitlan, who finally jumped in too, but afterwards became the moon. And the newborn sun needed movement, because if it did not move, the world would have neither day nor night, only a still light that nourished no one. And the movement of the sun demanded blood. The gods themselves sacrificed themselves at that first dawn of the fifth sun, offering their divine blood to set the wheel of the cosmos in motion. And ever since, humanity has been bound to continue that sacrifice, to offer blood, the most precious substance that exists, for it is the liquid of life, to keep the sun in motion, to ensure that the fifth sun does not end as the 4 before it did, to remain part of a cosmos that exists only because someone is willing to pay the price for its continuity. That is the reason for human sacrifice in Aztec cosmology. It was not cruelty, although the consequences for the victims were brutal. It was not sadism, although the ritual had aspects that seem incomprehensible to us today. It was, within that belief system, a cosmic necessity, a debt that humanity owed to the gods and which had to be paid regularly, just as one pays a mortgage, so as not to lose the entire house. Modern historians have estimated that the Aztecs sacrificed tens of thousands of people annually across their entire territory. Although the exact figures are a matter of debate and were probably considerably exaggerated by the Spanish conquistadors to justify their own violence. What is certain is that sacrifice was a central institution of the Aztec state, that one of the main functions of war was the capture of prisoners for the altar, and that the city of Tenochtitlan was designed in part as a setting for these rituals. But let us return to Itzcoatl and his mourning. For the ordinary citizen of Tenochtitlan lived in a world where sacrifice existed as a permanent backdrop, just as gravity exists for us. Something that is always there, but does not occupy the foreground of every moment of daily life. Most of the time, life in Tenochtitlan was simply that, life, with its rhythm of work and rest, of market and kitchen, of love and quarrel and laughter and tears. Itzcoatl has already stepped out into the courtyard of his house. The courtyard is small, but has a fountain of clean water, supplied by the Chapultepec aqueduct, and a small garden where Xochitl grows marigolds and edible quilites. The whole city is full of these domestic gardens, of these islands of green amidst the stone and adobe. The Aztecs loved flowers with a passion that their chroniclers repeatedly recorded. There were royal botanical gardens where the Tlatoani kept plants brought from every corner of the empire. And in the markets, flowers were sold alongside maize and cocoa as an essential part of daily life. Itzcoatl's breakfast is a corn tortilla with black beans and green chili, accompanied by a glass of water with unsweetened cocoa. Unsweetened cocoa, bitter and frothy, was the drink of working men. Cocoa sweetened with honey and mixed with vanilla was reserved for nobles and warriors. This distinction says a great deal about Aztec society. There was a strict order in everything, including what was drunk at breakfast. Aztec society was hierarchical in a way that Europeans of the same period would have readily recognized, although the details of that hierarchy were very different. Is greater than, at the very top, was the Tlatoani, the great orator, whose title alone says much about his nature. Power in the Aztec world was also exercised through the spoken word. Below the Tlatoani were the nobility, the Pipiltin, who had privileged access to education, to land, to to military and religious offices, and beneath them, the bulk of the population, the Mashalten, the common people, among whom was Itzcoatl. But there was something about Aztec society that distinguished it from many other class-based societies of the time: the real, though limited, possibility of social advancement through military merit. A warrior who captured a certain number of enemies in combat could rise in rank regardless of his origins. He could wear clothes that would otherwise have been forbidden to him, eat food reserved for the nobles, receive land and honors. War was, among other things, a social ladder, and that possibility of advancement gave young Aztecs from the lower classes a very powerful motivation to excel on the battlefield. Itzcoatl's sons attend the Calmecac, the higher education school that trained young men for the priesthood and public life. The eldest is 14 and already shows aptitudes that his teachers appreciate. He has a good memory, speaks well, and learns classical Nahuatl from the sacred texts quickly. The younger one, aged 12, is quieter, but his teachers say he has the hands of a craftsman, something his father has also noticed. Perhaps he will follow in his father's trade. Or perhaps he will find in war the gateway to a different life. Education in the Aztec world was universal and compulsory, which is surprising when one considers that in Europe during the same period, education was the privilege of the elites and the clergy. All Aztec children, boys and girls of any social class, had to go to school. The children of the nobility attended the Calmecac, where they learnt writing, astronomy, the calendar, sacred history, music and rhetoric. The children of the common people went to the Telpocali, the house of the young, where they learnt history and traditions, but above all military training and the practical skills necessary for life in the city and the countryside. Girls also went to school, although their education took a different approach. They were trained to be weavers, to take part in religious rituals, and to manage the household. Is greater than, but they also received an education in the sacred texts, in the history of the people, and in the ceremonies that structured the year. Aztec women had more autonomy than early European chroniclers were willing to acknowledge. They could be priestesses, they could participate in trade, and they could inherit and own property. They did not have equality with men, which was something that no society in the 15th century granted to women anywhere in the world. But neither were they the utterly subordinate figures that the colonial gaze tended to see. Itzcoatl has arrived at his workshop. It is a spacious room with windows facing east, where 3 apprentices, whom he has been training for 2 years, work alongside him. On the tables, carefully laid out, lie feathers from dozens of different species, the iridescent green of the quetzal, the impossible blue of the cotinga, the scarlet red of the macaw, the golden yellow of the oriole. Each feather has been catalogued, cleaned, and stored under controlled conditions. The art of feather work, or plumeria, was one of the most highly valued arts in the Aztec world, comparable in status to goldsmithing or stone carving. The Amonteca, the master feather workers, had their own neighborhood in the city, their own patron god, their own ceremonies. They considered themselves heirs to a tradition that came directly from the Toltecs, the mythical people who, in the Aztec imagination, represented the perfection of civilization and the arts. Itzcoatl has spent 20 years learning and practicing his craft. His hands know the weight and texture of every feather, just as a musician knows the strings of his instrument. And what he creates is no trivial decoration. The feather ornaments that leave his workshop are destined to adorn the elite warriors, the priests at great ceremonies, the Tlatoani himself on the most solemn occasions. He is currently crafting a shield for a high-ranking military commander. The shield features a design of a blue hummingbird on a red background, which is the emblem of the god Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and the sun, who is the patron deity of the Mexicas. The work is meticulous to the point of obsession. Every feather must be perfectly aligned with those around it, perfectly attached to the leather and cane base, perfectly integrated into the overall design. A feathered shield of this caliber can take weeks to complete. And when it is finished, when that blue hummingbird glows in the sun of the square with all the intensity of its natural color, it is hard to say whether it is art or magic. The Aztecs probably would not have understood the distinction. Whilst Itzcoatl works, the city around him goes about its bustling, noisy life. Tenochtitlán at its peak had between 200 and 300,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the world at that time. To give a point of reference, in the year 1480, London had some 50,000 inhabitants. Rome barely exceeded that figure. Only a few Asian cities, such as Beijing and Vijayanagara in India, had populations comparable to that of the Aztec capital. And that population lived in a city which, according to all who described it, was of astonishing beauty and order. The main thoroughfares crossing the lake to the mainland were as wide as the finest streets in European cities. The canals crisscrossing the city in all directions were clean and bustling with traffic of canoes laden with goods. The markets, and especially the great market of Tlatelolco, to the north of Tenochtitlan were spectacles that left visitors arriving from other parts of the empire speechless. The market of Tlatelolco. Let us pause here, because that market deserves a description of its own. When Hernán Cortés's Spanish soldiers saw it for the first time, in the year 1519, some of them wrote that they had never seen or imagined anything like it. Not in Spain, not in Italy, not in the Arab markets of the Mediterranean. It had sections dedicated to every type of product, organized with a precision that would have done credit to any modern logistics system. Here the sellers of gold, silver, and jade. There the sellers of cotton and henequen fabrics. Further on, those selling spices and medicinal plants. Elsewhere, the sellers of live animals, and in the center, the sellers of prepared food, where one could sit down and eat a hot meal amidst the hustle and bustle of the largest market in the Western Hemisphere. Because that was the Tlatelolco market, the commercial heart of an entire hemisphere. Goods passed through it from places the Aztecs had known and traded with for generations. Jade from the rivers of Guatemala, cocoa from the warm lands of the Gulf and the Pacific, quetzal feathers from the jungles of Chiapas, turquoise from the northern deserts, obsidian from the volcanic mines of Pachuca, salt from the coasts of the two oceans, cotton from the lowlands, tobacco from the humid valleys, vanilla from Totonacapan. The Aztec Empire was not merely military. It was also, and perhaps above all, commercial. The network of trade routes radiating out from Tenochtitlan reached every corner of that we now call Mexico and parts of Central America. The Pochteca, professional merchants who were simultaneously spies and diplomats in the service of the empire, traveled along these routes for months, sometimes years, carrying luxury goods to distant markets and bringing back products that Tenochtitlan could not produce itself. The Pochteca were a peculiar social class within the Aztec world, difficult to classify within the binary framework of nobility and commoners. They were not noble by birth, but possessed wealth that surpassed that of many nobles. They had their own gods, their own ceremonies, their own neighborhoods in the city. And they had something that few other social groups in the Aztec world could claim to have: the ability to act with relative autonomy, to negotiate and make decisions without depending directly on the orders of the Tlatoani. They traveled in organized groups, with porters who carried the goods on their shoulders, because in the Aztec world there were no domestic pack animals. There were no horses, oxen, or mules. Everything was transported on the backs of human beings, by canoe along rivers and lakes, or on the shoulders of specialized porters called taymeems, who could carry loads of 20 or 30 kilograms for entire days across mountains and jungles. This absence of pack animals is one of the factors most frequently cited to explain the differences in technological development between Mesoamerican and Eurasian civilizations. Without the horse, without the ox, without the camel, the capacity for transport and therefore for large-scale economic integration was much more limited. But the Aztecs compensated for this limitation with an extraordinary human organization, with systems of porters and trade routes that operated with an efficiency which Spanish chroniclers described with admiration, though also with a certain incredulity. Let us leave the market and return to the gods. For daily life in Tenochtitlan was structured not only by economic and social needs, but by a sacred calendar that determined every aspect of existence: when to sow and when to harvest, when to go to war and when to negotiate, when to marry and when to separate, when to baptize children and when to make the great sacrifices. Time in the Aztec world was not a straight line moving towards the future. It was a system of overlapping cycles, like cogwheels of different sizes which, as they turned, created unique and unrepeatable combinations. The first calendar was the Zhu-Po-Wali, the solar year of 365 days, divided into 18 months of 20 days each, plus 5 Nemontami days. The empty days at the end of the year that were considered dangerous and inauspicious. During those 5 days, people avoided undertaking any new activity as far as possible. They did not set out on journeys. They did not start businesses. They did not get married. It was the time of the threshold, the space between one year and the next, where the normal rules of the cosmos were dangerously relaxed. The second calendar was the Tonal Powali, the ritual calendar of 260 days, divided into 13 months of 20 days. This was the calendar of destinies, the one that determined the sign under which each person was born and, therefore, their character and their fortune. A child born under the sign of Seacatl, one read, which was the sign of the god Quetzalcoatl, would have a noble and spiritual destiny. A child born under Nahui Ehecatl, four winds, would be marked by a life of instability and a tragic end. A child born under Ometochtli, two rabbit, would have a tendency towards excess and pulk. The combination of these two calendars, the solar and the ritual, created a greater cycle of 52 years called Shio Malpili, the bundle of years, which was the Aztec equivalent of a century. At the end of each 52-year cycle, in the days preceding the start of the new cycle, the threat of the end of the world was real and palpable for the Aztecs. If the gods decided not to kindle the new fire, is greater than if the sun did not rise. The world would end in that definitive darkness which the Aztecs called Tlaltecutli, and the Tsimim, the stellar monsters that always lurked at the edges of the cosmos, would descend to devour humanity. To avert that fate, at the end of each 52-year cycle, the ceremony of the new fire was held. On the mountain of Huixactecatl, south of the lake, the priests extinguished every fire in the Aztec world. Literally every single one is greater than and waited whilst the entire city was plunged into absolute darkness. If the sun rose at dawn on that critical day, a priest would kindle the new fire by piercing the sacred wood on the chest of a sacrificial prisoner with a stick. And that new fire was carried in torches to all the temples, and from there to every home in Tenochtitlan and throughout the empire. It was a dawn that could not be taken for granted. It was a dawn that had to be earned. This intimate relationship with the possibility of the end of the world had consequences for the way the Aztecs lived their daily lives. There is an intensity in their art, an urgency in their rituals, a willingness to live fully in the present that is best understood when one realizes that, for them, the present was always a fragile achievement. The fifth sun could come to an end. The night might not give way to dawn. And faced with that possibility, the only response was to live with all the intensity that time allowed. The Aztec gods were many. Scholars of the Mexica pantheon have identified more than 200 distinct deities, although many of them were in fact different aspects of a smaller number of fundamental cosmic forces. They were gods of water and gods of fire, gods of the wind and gods of the earth, gods of maize and gods of pulque, gods of the hunt and gods of trade, gods of death and gods of love, gods of war and gods of creation. Huitzilopochtli was the most important god for the Mexicas. His name means hummingbird of the left, or hummingbird of the south, and he was both the god of the sun and the god of war. According to the most sacred Aztec myth, Huitzilopochtli was born fully armed from the womb of his mother, Coatlicue, at the very moment his sister Coyolxauhqui was attempting to kill her. The newborn Huitzilopochtli killed his sister and dismembered her, throwing her body from the summit of the sacred hill. That myth was the cosmological justification for war and sacrifice. Just as Huitzilopochtli defeated his enemies and fed the sun with his victory, so the Aztec warriors were to defeat their enemies and feed the sun with the blood of the vanquished. The statue of Coyolxauhqui, discovered by chance in Mexico City in 1978 during construction work in the historic center, was the most important archaeological find of the 20th century in Mesoamerica. It is a stone disc almost 3 meters in diameter, depicting the dismembered goddess, with her head severed from her body and her limbs scattered in a fallen position. It was found exactly where archaeologists would have predicted, at the foot of the southern staircase of the Templo Maya, at the point where the bodies of the sacrificed rolled after being thrown from the top. Myth and archaeology came together in that stone disk in a way that left researchers speechless. But whilst Huitzilopochtli was the god of strength and war, there was another god in the Aztec pantheon who represented something entirely different and who was, in his own way, equally fundamental, Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. Quetzalcoatl was the god of wisdom, of the wind, of artistic creation, of the priesthood. He was associated with the planet Venus, with the knowledge of books and the calendar, with the possibility of a relationship between humans and the divine that did not necessarily involve blood, but rather contemplation and learning. The tension between Huitzilopochtli and Quetzalcoatl, between military might and contemplative wisdom, between bloody sacrifice and ascetic self-mortification, runs through the entire Aztec culture like an underground river. They were not opposing forces, but complementary ones, two distinct ways of relating to the sacred that coexisted within the same civilization. And in that coexistence, there is something that speaks to us of the true complexity of Aztec culture, of its capacity to sustain contradictions that from the outside may seem irreconcilable, but which, from within, formed a coherent whole. There is a third great god who deserves special attention, Tlaloc, the god of rain. His importance to a civilization that depended on maize for survival was so fundamental that he shared the summit of the Templo Maya with Huitzilopochtli. The two shrines that crowned Tenochtitlan's most important pyramid were, precisely, the shrine of Huitzilopochtli and the shrine of Tlaloc, war and rain, blood and water, political, military power, and the fertility of the land. Tlaloc was an ancient god, far older than the Mexicas themselves. He appears in the paintings of Teotihuacan, the great metropolis that preceded the Aztecs in the Valley of Mexico, and which fell in the early centuries AD under circumstances still debated by archaeologists. Tlaloc belonged to the deepest stratum of Mesoamerican religiosity, to that layer of beliefs that transcends cultural boundaries and had been present in some form in practically all the civilizations of the region for centuries. His appearance is unmistakable, round eyes surrounded by serpentine rings, a large mouth with curved fangs, a square nose. It is a face one does not forget once seen. And if one visits the National Museum of Anthropology in Mexico today and stands before the great Mexica Hall, that face of Tlaloc follows you from every angle, from funerary urns and figurines and sculpted monuments, as if the god of rain were still watching over, ensuring no one forgets his place in the order of the world. The Aztec priests who served Tlaloc painted their bodies black and blue, wore ornaments made of paper and rubber, and performed ceremonies in which young children played the most important roles. During the months of the sacred calendar dedicated to rain, particularly in the month of Atlkawalo at the start of the year, offerings were made to the Tlalocs, Tlaloc's assistants who lived in mountain caves and controlled the different types of rain. And these offerings included, on special occasions, the sacrifice of small children whose cries, according to Aztec belief, were the voice of water calling for rain. It is at these moments that the gulf between our perspective and theirs becomes wider and harder to bridge. The sacrifice of children is something that no modern value system can accept, and we shall not attempt here to relativize it to the point of making it tolerable. Yet neither can we understand Aztec civilization if we reduce it to that isolated fact, taking it out of the context of the cosmology in which it made sense and the belief system that made it. For those who practiced it, not only acceptable but sacred and necessary. The Aztec world was not a world of gratuitous cruelty. It was a world where violence was ritualized, framed, directed towards specific cosmological ends. Death was not the end of anything. It was a transition, a transformation, a step towards other forms of existence that the sacred calendar described with precision. Warriors who died in battle or on the sacrificial altar did not truly die. They became companions of the sun, brightly colored birds fluttering eternally in the gardens of the eastern sky. Women who died in childbirth, which, in Aztec thought, was also a battle, accompanied the sun on its journey across the western sky. Those who died by drowning or from a lightning strike went to Tlalocan, the watery paradise of the rain god, where the vegetation was evergreen and water was never in short supply. And those who died a natural death, from illness or old age, went to Mictlan, the underworld, where they had to undertake a 4-year journey through 9 subterranean levels before reaching their final resting place. For that journey they needed provisions and guides, which their relatives provided by burning offerings during funeral rites. The dog was the animal that guided the deceased across the river, separating the world of the living from the first level of Mictlan. And for this reason, the skeletons of Xoloitzcuintla dogs, the hairless dogs bred specifically for this purpose, have been found in many Aztec tombs. There is something profoundly human about this geography of the afterlife. The idea that death is not the end, but a journey. That this journey has a specific topography with its dangers and its aids. That the living can do something to make that journey easier for those who have departed. These are ideas that appear in practically every culture in the world and in practically every period of history. The Aztecs developed them with extraordinary specificity and coherence, integrating them into a cosmological system where every aspect of life and death had its place and its meaning. Let us return to the surface of the world. Let us return to Itzcoatl in his workshop, to the city pulsating around him, to that year when the Aztec Empire was at the zenith of its power and extent. The Aztec Empire. That term requires some clarification, because the Aztecs themselves would not have called it that, or at least not exactly that. What modern historians call the Aztec Empire was formerly the Triple Alliance, a confederation of 3 city-states on Lake Texcoco, is greater than Tenochtitlan, Texcoco and Tlacopan, which, from the early decades of the 15th century, systematically conquered most of the territory we now call central Mexico and parts of Oaxaca, Guerrero, Hidalgo, Veracruz, and the Soconusco region on the border with Guatemala. The alliance was not one of equals. Tenochtitlan was clearly the dominant power, and its Tlatoani was the supreme ruler of the confederation. Although the kings of Texcoco and Tlacopan maintained their own courts and their own autonomy in internal affairs. Texcoco, in fact, was a city of extraordinary cultural sophistication, whose most famous king, Nezahualcóyotl, ruled from 1441 to 1472 and was at once a warrior and a poet, a lawmaker and a philosopher, an architect and an astronomer. His poems, written in classical Nahuatl, are considered by many specialists to be among the most beautiful works of pre-Hispanic literature. In his verses, Nezahualcóyotl asked a question that any human being from any era might ask, whether flowers and songs, whether art and beauty are the only enduring truth in a world where everything passes. He contemplated mortality with a gaze that did not shy away from pain, yet did not succumb to nihilism. And he found in the practice of art and thought a form of permanence that the Aztecs of Tenochtitlan more often sought in war and sacrifice. This difference between the 2 great cities of the Triple Alliance, between the militaristic pragmatism of Tenochtitlan and the contemplative refinement of Texcoco, enriches our understanding of the Aztec world. It was not a cultural monolith. It was a complex and pluralistic civilization, with internal debates, tensions, and differences that the Spanish conquistadors, who arrived when the empire was at the height of its power but also of growing fragility, were unable or unwilling to see. The empire's expansion was the result of a combination of factors that historians have analyzed from multiple perspectives. The immediate driving force was the need for tribute. The empire was financed through the taxes that the conquered peoples were required to pay regularly to Tenochtitlan. These tributes took the form of cotton blankets, cocoa, feathers, furs, jade, gold, turquoise, food, slaves. The list of tributes that the subjugated peoples paid to the Triple Alliance is detailed in the documents known as the Matricula de Tributos and the Codex Mendoza, which survived the conquest and today allow us to reconstruct the economic geography of the empire with considerable precision. But tribute was the result, not the cause, of expansion. The deeper cause must be sought in the internal logic of a society where war was at once a religious necessity, a form of social mobility, an expression of collective identity, and a tool of foreign policy. The Aztecs did not wage war only when they wished to conquer new territories. They waged war because waging war was part of what it meant to be Aztec. The Flower War, the Exochiotl, was a unique institution of the Aztec world that perfectly illustrates this logic. It was a type of war agreed in advance between states that already recognized each other as adversaries, whose aim was not to destroy the enemy, but to capture prisoners for sacrifice. The states of Tlaxcala, Cholula, Huexotzingo, and others in the eastern part of the Valley of Mexico maintained this kind of ritualized warlike relationship through the Triple Alliance, which provided both sides with the prisoners required by their religious systems. This institution has been much debated by historians. Some see it as evidence of the fundamentally religious nature of Aztec warfare. Others interpret it as a deliberate policy of the empire to keep the eastern states sufficiently weak so as not to pose a threat, but without conquering them, because their function as a source of sacrificial victims made them more useful as permanent adversaries than as subjugated territories. What is clear is that Tlaxcala, the most powerful city-state in that region, was never conquered by the Aztecs. And when Hernan Cortés arrived in the year 1519, the Tlaxcaltecs became his most important allies. Is greater than without the Tlaxcaltec warriors, numbering in the tens of thousands and possessing a thorough understanding of the tactics and weaknesses of the Aztec army. The Spanish conquest of Tenochtitlan would have been impossible. The defeat of the Aztec Empire was, to a large extent, a defeat inflicted by other Mesoamerican peoples who had suffered for decades under the yoke of the Triple Alliance and who saw in the men with strange skin and shining armor an opportunity to free themselves from that yoke. But let us not get ahead of ourselves. We are still in the 15th century, in the empire's years of greatest splendor, and we wish to understand what life was like within that empire at the height of its power. The Tlatoani who led the empire to its zenith was Moctezuma I, known as Ilhuicamina, he who pierces the sky with an arrow. Is greater than. He ruled from the year 1440 to 1469, nearly 3 decades during which the territory under Aztec control doubled and the ceremonial apparatus of Tenochtitlan reached unprecedented magnificence. It was under his rule that the great Chapultepec aqueduct was built, that the first Templo Mayor was expanded to its most imposing form, and that the tax system was codified and bureaucratized until it became the administrative machine that would allow the empire to function for decades more. Moctezuma I was also the ruler who faced the great famine that the Aztecs called Tenochtli, one rabbit, which lasted from 1450 to 1454. It was one of the most devastating natural disasters in the history of Mesoamerica. 4 consecutive years of late frosts, droughts, and poor harvests that reduced a substantial part of the population of the Valley of Mexico to famine. The Tlatoani's response to the catastrophe revealed both his capacity for governance and the structural limitations of his system. He opened the state granaries to feed the population, organized the distribution of reserve food, but also increased human sacrifices because the catastrophe was interpreted as a sign that the gods were dissatisfied and required more offerings. The Tenochtli famine left deep scars on the Aztec collective memory. It was during that crisis that many families sold their children into slavery to merchants on the coast, where maize was more abundant, in exchange for enough food to survive the winter. When the crisis ended, when the rains returned and the harvests recovered, Moctezuma I undertook a series of military campaigns of renewed intensity, which historians have interpreted in part as a response to the trauma of the famine. It was necessary to secure access to tribute from the warm lands, where maize did not depend on the capricious rains of the highlands. The territorial expansion that followed the famine took the empire eastwards, towards the Gulf Coast, and southwards, towards the warm lands of present-day Guerrero. The peoples inhabiting these regions, including the Totonacs, the Mazatecs, the Mixtecs, and dozens of smaller groups, were incorporated into the Aztec tribute system with varying degrees of violence and resistance. Some accepted Aztec rule without much resistance, calculating that the tribute was a reasonable price to pay for peace and access to the trade networks of the Triple Alliance. Others resisted for years or decades, forcing the Aztec army to launch repeated campaigns of reconquest. The Aztec army was an institution that warrants a detailed description, as it was one of the most sophisticated of its time anywhere in the world. It was not a standing army in the modern sense. In times of peace, the warriors returned to their civilian occupations. But training was universal and constant, and mobilization could take place with surprising speed. The most conservative estimates suggest that Tenochtitlan could mobilize between 80,000 and 100,000 warriors at the height of military effort, a figure that exceeded the capacity of any European army of the same period. Aztec warriors were organized into a system of ranks, distinguished externally by the costumes and ornaments they wore. lower-ranking warriors fought with virtually no protection, wearing little more than a loincloth and a shield made of wood and leather. Mid-ranking warriors wore padded cotton armor which, although it appeared fragile, offered significant protection against arrows and blows from enemy bows and slings. And the elite warriors, the Kuachik and the Otomi, those who had captured 4 or more prisoners, wore costumes that transformed them into jaguars or eagles, the 2 sacred animals of Aztec warfare. Aztec weapons were also the subject of admiration and analysis. The most famous was the macuahuitl, a wooden sword whose blade was edged on both sides with obsidian blades. Obsidian, a natural volcanic glass which the Aztecs carved to produce edges sharper than any metal known in Europe at the time, was the most prized material for warfare. A well-crafted obsidian blade could cut through flesh and bone with terrifying efficiency. Spanish chroniclers who fought against the Aztecs described the macuahuitl as a weapon capable of decapitating a horse with a single blow, although this claim is likely an exaggeration for the purposes of conquest propaganda. Bows and arrows, spears and atlatls, spear-throwing devices that gave a projectile a speed and force far superior to what the human arm alone could generate, completed the arsenal. And Aztec warfare was not just individual combat, it included formations, collective tactics, and systems of signals and communication on the battlefield that demonstrated a level of military sophistication which the early Spanish conquistadors took longer than they would have liked to recognize. War also had its own ceremonies, its own rituals, its own specific gods. Before a campaign, there were days of fasting and prayer, of self-sacrifice and consultation with the priests to determine the most auspicious moment according to the sacred calendar. Is greater than the Tlatoani, or commander of the expedition, made offerings at the Templo Mayor before setting out. And when the army returned victorious, the prisoners were presented at a public ceremony celebrating the empire's triumph and honoring the most distinguished warriors. There was a Tlatoani in the second half of the 15th century who took these ceremonies to an unprecedented scale. His name was Ahuitzotl, and he ruled from 1486 to 1502. He was the 8th Tlatoani of Tenochtitlán, nephew of Moctezuma I, and was probably the most militarily aggressive ruler in the entire history of the Aztecs. Under his rule, the empire reached its greatest geographical extent, extending to the borders of present-day Oaxaca and penetrating along the Pacific coast to what is now the border between Mexico and Guatemala. In the year 1487, Ahuitzotl inaugurated the rebuilt Templo Mayor with a ceremony that Aztec and Spanish chroniclers described in such detail that, even allowing for possible exaggerations, the accounts are harrowing. According to these sources, over 4 consecutive days of ceremonial sacrifice, hundreds, possibly thousands of prisoners of war were sacrificed on the temple's summit to consecrate the renovated building. The most extreme accounts speak of 20,000 victims, a figure that many historians consider impossible from a logistical point of view, but which highlights the extraordinary scale the event must have had. Ahuitzotl was also a frontline warrior who fought alongside his soldiers. The animal whose name he adopted as his title, the Ahuitzotl, was a mythological creature associated with water and death, a sort of supernatural otter with hands at the end of its tail which, according to legend, dragged humans into the depths of lakes. An image that aptly describes the personality of the Tlatoani who chose it: powerful, relentless, and with a special relationship with death. Under Ahuitzotl, Tenochtitlan's second aqueduct was also built, bringing fresh water from Coyoacán. The legend says that Ahuitzotl died because of that aqueduct during a flood caused by the excess water that the new system brought into the city. His greater than the Tlatoani struck his head against a door lintel whilst fleeing the waters and never fully recovered from the injury. He died in the year 1502, leaving an empire at the height of its expansion, but also with the internal tensions that expansion had generated. He was succeeded by the man who would go down in history as the most famous figure in the Aztec world, the Tlatoani, whose name has reached every corner of the world as a symbol of an encounter that changed the history of 2 hemispheres, Moctezuma II, known as the Zarko Yatsin, the younger or the respected. He was the 9th Tlatoani of Tenochtitlan and reigned from 1502 to 1520. Moctezuma II was a ruler of extraordinary political sophistication, though also of a personality that chroniclers describe as changeable and at times contradictory. He profoundly reformed the court of Tenochtitlan, increasing the ceremonial pomp and the distance between the Tlatoani and his subjects to extremes that his predecessors would not have recognized. When Moctezuma appeared in public, his feet could not touch the ground. He walked on rugs that his servants spread out before him, and those who looked him directly in the eye could be severely punished. The power of the Tlatoani had become so deified that it made the ruler's person something closer to the sacred than to the human. This deification of power had consequences that proved fatal when the foreigners from the east arrived. When Hernán Cortés landed on the shores of the Gulf in the year 1519, the messengers sent by Moctezuma to receive him sent the Tlatoani descriptions of those strange creatures arriving in floating houses, with animals never before seen and with weapons that thundered and spewed fire. And Moctezuma, a man of profound religious training and keen awareness of the signs of the times, interpreted what his emissaries told him through the lens of his cosmological beliefs. That filter was, above all, the legend of Quetzalcoatl. According to the tradition that the Mexicas themselves had inherited and developed, the god Quetzalcoatl, in his human form, had been a just and wise ruler who had left his homeland in the east, promising to return. And the year of his return coincided, according to the Aztec calendar, with the Seacatl year. One read, the sign of Quetzalcoatl himself. The year in which Cortés arrived, 1519, was precisely a Seacatl year in the Aztec calendar. Historians still debate whether this coincidence was decisive in Moctezuma's response to the arrival of the Spaniards, or whether the legend of Quetzalcoatl's return was fabricated after the conquest to explain the Tlatoani's apparent passivity in the face of the threat. There are serious arguments on both sides, but what is undeniable is that Moctezuma did not respond to Cortés' arrival with the military force that his position as ruler of the most powerful empire in Mesoamerica would have allowed him. Instead, he negotiated. He sent gifts. He attempted to persuade the foreigners to leave through diplomacy and the magnificence of the gifts he sent them. And when Cortés finally arrived in Tenochtitlán in November 1519, Moctezuma went out to receive him in person on the Iztapalapa causeway. It was an encounter that no one who had witnessed it could ever forget. The Tlatoani of the most powerful empire in the Americas, surrounded by his court of nobles and priests, with his Quetzal feather headdress and his jade and gold ornaments, facing a group of strange men with their steel armor glinting in the November sun. But that belongs to the next chapter of this story. Today we are in the before, in that world that existed as a complete entity in itself, with its gods and its rituals and its markets and its craftsmen and its warriors and its poets. In that world where Itzcoatl, the master featherworker, lived with the quiet normality of one who does not know that his world is about to end. Because worlds do not end suddenly. They end little by little, with signs that can only be clearly read in hindsight. In the final years before the conquest, Aztec chroniclers recorded a series of ominous omens that the collective consciousness interpreted as warnings: a comet, a fire in the temple of Huitzilopochtli that could not be extinguished, a column of light in the east that appeared before dawn for a whole year, Lake Texcoco, which suddenly churned without a breeze on a calm night, a woman who wept at night as she wandered the streets, her cries saying, "My little ones, we are about to be lost." She was La Llorona, whose lament foreshadowed the end of a world. But whilst those omens accumulated in the collective memory, the city carried on with its daily life. The canals remained full of canoes. The market at Tlatelolco remained the commercial heart of the known world. The priests continued to light the fire on the summit of the Templo Maya every dawn. Is greater than. The master featherworkers continued to craft the ephemeral beauty of feathers. The poets continued to ask whether there is anything permanent in a world that passes. Nezahualcoyot, the poet king of Texcoco, had written decades earlier a question that now resonated with a new urgency. Do we truly live with our roots in the earth, not forever on earth, just a little while here? Even if it is jade, it will shatter. Even if it is gold, it will break. Even if it is Quetzal plumage, it will fall away. Not forever on earth, just a little while here. The Quetzal's feathers break off. The cities of stone crumble. Empires that seem eternal from within discover, always too late, that they are not. But tonight, whilst the city sleeps beneath its star-filled sky stars, the priests know one by one to which they have given names, destinies, and meaning. The Aztec world is still whole. The Tlalocs guard the water in their mountain caves. Huitzilopochtli rests his bow in the sanctuary at the summit of the Templo Maya. The lake reflects the moon with a calm that seems as it always has. And in his workshop, Itzcoatl has stopped working as evening falls. He has cleaned his tools with the slow gestures of a craftsman who respects his instruments. He has covered the feathers with cotton cloths to protect them from the night's dampness. He has given instructions to his apprentices for the following day. And now he walks home, through the streets of a city that does not know it is living out its final decades, with the calm stride of someone who trusts that tomorrow the sun will rise again. The sun has always risen again. The priests have done their work. The warriors have offered their spoils. The new fire has been lit every 52 years. The cosmos has been kept in motion by the constant effort and sacrifice of an entire people who believed, right to the end, that this was their mission in the world. There is greatness in that belief, though there was also a terrible price to pay. There is dignity in that people who conceived of themselves as the upholders of the universe, as the last bulwark between the cosmos and chaos. And there is an inescapable sadness in thinking that that world, with all its complexity and beauty and horror, ended in a way that no one within it could have foreseen. But that story comes later. For now, the city sleeps, is greater than. The lake reflects the stars with the patience of centuries. Somewhere in the temple, the sacred fire burns in the darkness, and the seconds pass, one after another, with the same tranquility with which they have always passed. carrying the world towards the dawn that is yet to come. Let that image stay with you as sleep comes. A city of water and stone and fire beneath a sky full of gods who watch over their own world. A craftsman walking home with hands the color of feathers. A lake breathing in the darkness like an immense, tranquil animal. And time, which never stops, but which tonight has the gentleness of something in no hurry. Tomorrow there will be more history. Tomorrow will bring the encounters and clashes and transformations that make the history of the Aztecs one of the most dramatic and moving that humanity has ever experienced. But that is tomorrow. Tonight, the Aztec world is complete, and you can rest within it.
Release the tension in your forehead. Relax the muscles around your eyes. Let your arms rest completely, heavy and warm at either side of your body. Your breath now flows naturally, like gentle waves lapping at the shore and receding effortlessly. The stories you have heard tonight slowly fade away, becoming distant whispers that you no longer need to follow. If this journey through time has served you well, you can support this space by liking, subscribing, or sharing your thoughts in the comments. That way, more people seeking rest may find refuge here. And if you are still awake, there is another story waiting in silence, ready to guide you deeper into sleep. But for now, let the voices of the past fade gently away. Let the names, dates, and events melt into the mist of the night's oblivion. The story can wait until tomorrow. Close your eyes. Let go of everything. Rest deeply, and may you have sweet dreams.